Okay.
Good, excellent. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. So we'll carry on the Gemara in continuing our attempt to learn the Gemara in Untitled base, the Gemara of Mevashel and Ofeh. I think last week we looked at the sugya in Avodah Zarah, which Tosfos references, Avodah Zarah Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, in which, in the context of Bishul Akum, the Gemara talks about throwing an akum, a pagan, who threw a piece of wood into the fire and something subsequently baked in the oven. And the Gemara discusses whether this would be bishul akum or not, whether there be an issue of bishul akum or not. And the Gemara says this is determined by whether the intention of the akum was to cook or not. And the Gemara says in this case of the peg, even though in the case of the peg, the food that's cooked through the peg being thrown into the fire is not bishul akum. Why not? Because this Ovid Chavim, this pagan who threw this peg into the oven, you would have said that it's bishul akum because his intention was to cook. Kamash malon, that he's potter, that is not bishul akum because his intention was to harden the peg rather than soften it, and therefore he is not bishul akum. So the Gemara in Avodah Zarah seems to say that with the peg, this does not count as bishul because the aim is to harden the peg. And the Gemara in Shabbos says that this does count as bishul because the aim is to, it's true, the aim is to harden the peg, but in the meantime, the peg becomes softened, and therefore this does count as bishul. So we have a stira between the Gemaras. We have a contradiction between the Gemara and Shabbos, which says you look at the interim stage of the softening of the peg, and the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which says we look at the ultimate stage of the hardening of the peg. That's the stira in the sugyas. And I use this
Rabbi.
Sorry, Zach, yes.
Me and Gary were wondering what role the hidden gourd played in all that, in the logic there. Is that just a sort of decoy that clearly the hidden gourd couldn't have anything to do with intention because it's hidden and the non-Jew didn't know about it? So the only intentionality could be to do with the peg, which he did intentionally throw in. Is that, am I on the right track? Or?
Yes, there's a lot of discussion about why the particular scenario the Gemara discusses is that there was a gourd hidden in it. It could be this is just the way the story happens, because the language of the Gemara is that it's not an abstract halacha. It's high over the chavim, etc. That pagan. So the Gemara seems to be saying it's a case where this is what happens to have happened. It could be the Gemara chooses this case because that demonstrates, as you say, that wasn't the intention of the pagan. It was clearly what he did was nothing to do with cooking. And it could be the point the Gemara is saying is that the Jew had no part in the process. When he put the gourd into the oven was off, as it were. And therefore, he buried it amongst the ashes rather than it being part of the cooking process, because there's a halacha in bishul akum that if a Jew is at all part of the process, then it ceases to be bishul akum. So if, for example, the flame is already on low when I put the gourd into the pot, and then afterwards the flame is turned up by the pagan, that wouldn't be bishul akum. So it's possible it's just the Gemara's way of saying he had no involvement in the process at all.
So I cheated somewhat and looked at the Sefaria translation, and it translates the shari there as being the gourd is permitted, and again, partly because of the reasoning that you're suggesting that if the Jew had partly cooked it, it would anyhow be permissible. I didn't understand it in the slightest. So Zach and I were doing battle on that bit. We were jointly
Gary, I lost you
not with one another. We were jointly doing battle.
I lost you at the crucial point. What translation were you querying?
So the Sefaria translation says when Avodah Zarah, the Gemara says shari, it says it means the gourd is permitted.
Correct.
Not that the peg is permitted. No,
sorry, that's absolutely correct. The gourd, again, the peg is not a food. The peg is being made into a peg. The shaila is the gourd bishul akum or not?
Well, we know anyhow it's not bishul akum because the Jew started cooking it.
No. So this is what I'm saying. The Jew did not start cooking it. It has to be a case that the Jew had played no part in the cooking of the gourd. So he put the gourd into the oven when the oven was off, in modern day terminology. So that's for some reason the Gemara expresses that as he buried the gourd in the oven. He just put the gourd in the oven, but did nothing in the cooking process. Now we have a shaila. Is the lighting of the fire done with the intention of hardening a peg considered a case where the pagan sets out to cook something, or is it a case where the pagan is doing something else, in which case his cooking process has nothing to do with the lighting process has nothing to do with cooking, and therefore this wouldn't be a scenario of bishul akum. If I can just contextualize this discussion of the Gemara, and if you saw in Sarah, then hopefully you looked at the earlier bits of the Gemara also. The context of this debate is a Gemara which discusses what happens when something is cooked completely incidentally to the intention of the pagan. And the Gemara discusses, for example, a case where someone burns a field and grasshoppers, locusts, get singed and cooked in the context of the burning of the field. Now the Jew wants to come and eat these delicious roast locusts, and the shaila is, well, they've been cooked only through the action of the pagan. Does this count as bishul akum? And the Gemara establishes the principle that if what the pagan did was completely removed from any intention to cook, then this will not count as bishul akum. So if he turns on the light, he lights the field because he wants to burn the field, and it happens to be that cooks the locust. This is not included in the takana of bishul akum. So similarly over here, the Gemara is arguing that the pagan is setting out to, the akum is setting out to harden the peg. The fact that the peg becomes cooked in the meantime, going through this ripoy status, is not relevant to his action. And that's the contradiction we're asking over here, because our Gemara in Shabbat says that no, it is very much relevant to the action of the thrower of the peg, the fact that it becomes cooked before it becomes hardened. And the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says no, we look at the end intention, that it becomes hardened, and we ignore the interim stage of it becoming cooked. So that's the steer between the sukkahs. And the reason I look at this steer here is A, because Tosfos already referenced the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, and because B, hopefully it'll help us understand a little bit better the definition of cooking in terms of Hilchos Shabbos.
So presumably you're saying if he actually put some food in to cook it, then the gourd about which he had no intention at all would be bishul akum.
That is exactly right. That's spot on, yes. That's the point of the Gemara. And therefore we need to determine, is the akum interested in cooking or baking pegs? Completely different action. Hardening pegs, completely different action. Okay, so that's the discussion. I'll just remind you very briefly, I'm not going to go into it again today. We looked at Tosfos' answer to the question, and Tosfos said a difficult answer. There were textual difficulties of Tosfos, in which he seems to refer to bishul akum as a chiyuv. Bishul akum is not a chiyuv, of course. There's no penalty for bishul akum. It's an issa. He also refers to Shabbos as being hichmiru. They were machmir. Our Gemara doesn't seem to be talking about a Durabanon, it seems to be talking about Deraisa. Okay, there's textual problems with Tosfos, but the broad thrust of Tosfos' answer seems to be identical to the Ritva in that we had to look at also. And the Ritva says this is something to do with melachot machshavos, intentionality. And he's using melachot machshavos, intentionality, with melacha in an unusual way, meaning to say that what we have over here is ikar kavanasoi, the main intention of the peg baker, which is to harden the peg. But we have a subsidiary kavana, which is that he wants to soften the peg because that's the way to get to harden it. And therefore, if we want to define the action, what action am I engaged in over here? The answer is normally we would say the action I'm engaged in is hardening a peg, not cooking. However, with Shabbos, there's a unique halacha that we care about the nuances of intentionality, the concept of melachot machshavos. And the nuances of intentionality mean that, therefore, even the subsidiary kavana of bishul is enough with respect to Shabbos to make you chayav. This is what the Ritva says. I mentioned already that the term melachot machshavos is endemic, comes up throughout Shabbos. It does not mean one halachic principle. It means lots and lots of things, amongst which is the Ritva's innovative use of this concept to teach us that we look at subsidiary machshava with Shabbos as opposed to with bishul akum. That was the Ritva's answer. We then began exploring a second answer to the question, which is the Ramban's answer. And the Ramban says, no, the answer to the question is that our Gemara is going according to is built upon the halachic principle of Pesik Reisha. What we have over here is a classic example of Dover She'einu Miskavin, an unintended side consequence, where something else happens incidental to my main activity. Normally, a Dover She'einu Miskavin is a machlokas. So if I drag a bench along and it happens to plow the earth patch along which I drag it, I have no, my intention is not to drag to plow the earth. Therefore, it's a Dover She'einu Miskavin. If it's a side consequence which is not inevitable, it will be a machlokas whether I'm chayiv or not. If it's an inevitable side consequence, it's a psik reisha, chopping off the head. You can't argue that side consequence is a side consequence if it's inevitable. The psik reisha svara, and therefore everyone would agree that I would be chayiv for such a situation, because the fact is, I've ploughed my field. Says the Ramban, this is what's going on in our Gemara. We have this halacha of psik reisha, and therefore the softening of the peg is an unintended side consequence. Davar she'eino miskavin. However, it's inevitable, and therefore with respect to Shabbos, that's enough to make me chayiv. However, with respect to Bishalakum, a Dover She'einu Miskavein, an unintended side consequence, is not halachically relevant, and that's the answer to the contradiction. Now, we asked on the Ramban two questions, or really on the Ramban one question, which led us to another question. The claim of the Ramban that this is a Dover She'einu Miskavein, an unintended side consequence, is very, very difficult to understand. This isn't an unintended side consequence. It's necessary. It's a necessary step of which I'm cognizant and wish to go through in order to get the end result, which is the hardening of the peg. The peg becomes hardened because the water is drawn out and boils away, and the peg becomes softened in the process. This isn't an unintended side consequence. This is a process, part of what I'm trying to do. Which halacha is this perhaps more similar to? Perhaps this is more similar to the concept of melacha she'ein sricha legufa, which is a completely separate halachic concept, not to be confused, even though the two are often mixed up, which is where I'm doing a melacha, and I know I'm doing the melacha, and I'm aware of doing the melacha, but my intention is for a side thing, not for the positive result of the melacha. So, for example, we said if I'm discarding rubbish, I have no interest in the end result of the rubbish being in the street. I have an interest in removing it from my domain. So this is not a positive intention. It's a melacha she'ein sricha legufa. I'm doing a melacha not for the guf melacha, for the purpose of the melacha, but to achieve something else. Another perhaps more intuitive example of this is Seder. If I trap a bee, I don't have an interest in having a trapped bee. If I trap a tiger, I want the tiger skin. If I trap a deer, I want the deer skin. So that's a melacha sricha legufa. I'm doing a melacha to achieve the end result of melacha. I want the trapping to have occurred. With the bee, I have no interest in the bee. I want to remove the bee. The way of removing the bee is I don't really want the bee in the cup. I just don't want the bee in the rest of the room. And therefore, this is a melacha she'ein sricha legufa. This is a melacha which isn't needed for the primary purpose of the melacha. And that would appear to be the case with the softening of the wood. That this is the correct halachic event going on over here is a melacha she'ein sricha legufa, where I don't have the primary intention. I mentioned also this should not be confused with a third halachic category, which is mekalkel, which is when I'm doing a melacha, which is damaging. I'm not going to go into that now. Listen to the last shiur. So this is a second question over here, that surely what's going on over here is a melacha she'ein sricha legufa. I'm removing the liquid. I don't want the liquid. It's not that I want the liquid or the wood to soften. It's that that's the only way to achieve my real goal, which is melacha, which is the hardening of the peg. A final question over here is that this would appear to be a temporary melacha. There's a general rule that you're only chayiv on Shabbos if you do a melacha hamit kayemet, a melacha which has a permanence to it. If it doesn't have a permanence to it, then it is d'Rabbanan. So, for example, if I write in on steam on a glass, I write some lettering. Since this is not miskayim, this is only short term. This wouldn't be enough to be a melacha. If I tie a kesher, a knot, which is a bow, but not a kesher shel kayama, it's not a permanent knot, then at most this would be an Issa Rabbanon, or even less than that. A melacha which is not kayam, which has no continuity to it, is not a melacha. Melacha means engagement with a creative activity to achieve a certain chashivus of result. If the result is not choshuv, if it's not significant, it's not a melacha. One example of an insignificant result is mekalkel, where it's not a positive result, but a negative result. Another example is where it's a temporary result, not a permanent result. Now, seemingly, the softening of the words is a very temporary result because, of course, A few minutes later, as it remains in the kiln, it will become hardened, which is the permanent result that I wish to achieve. So this is a melacha which is not miskayim, and this is the third question on the sugya. Now I think all these questions are answered by the Shiur L'Ran, which I printed in handouts labeled Ofeh 3 at the top of page. I think I printed it. Yes, I printed it at the top of page 2 in handout 3. The Meyuchas L'Ran, the text that is ascribed to the Ran. I think I mentioned before the Ran. Ran Rabbeinu Nissim, one of the very important Spanish Rishonim, generation of the Rashba, the Ritva, meaning a generation and a half after the Ramban. This particular Rishon that we have on Shabbos was ascribed through the generations to the Ran. In more recent times, researchers and academics don't believe that it really is the Ran, and therefore it's been renamed the Meyuchas L'Ran. The source ascribed it to the Ran rather than being the Ran itself. Nonetheless, we treat it as a Rishon because it definitely dates back to the 1300s in Spain. So if it wasn't written by the Ran himself, it was written by someone from that Beis Medrash, someone around that yeshiva world. And one can see from the topics discussed by the Ran and the language that it was a great figure. This was a master of Talmud, and therefore we learn it as a Rishon, even though we don't know exactly which Rishon wrote it. Possible that it was an earlier version, by the way, of the Ritva. It's possible that it was a younger Ritva, for example, who wrote it. Either way, I think in the Ran lies an answer to all these questions. And the Ran says, "V'lekin ameima." I've printed this on the top of Sorshi of page 2. V'lekin ameima de lagabe Shabbos nami kiven she'ein tzorech lo'isa bishul haveli melacha she'ein tzrich legufa. So the Ran asks this question. He says, "Why is it not a melacha she'ein tzrich legufa? Since I don't need it for Shabbos, I don't need the softening. I'm sorry, I don't need the softening. I only need the hardening." Ve'oi davar she'ein miskavin. He says it's also davar she'ein miskavin. Interesting. He says, "Kiven de e efshar belav hochin pesik reishahu. V'chashlina neik melacha tzrich legufa. Da b'shuri v'shuri mana ba'in ke'echad." It's a very, very confusing Ran. The Ran says, since there's a Pesik Reisha, which is the same language as the Ramban, this Ran, or Meyuchas L'Ran, this ascribed text of the Ramban, belongs to the same Beis Medrash as the students of the Ramban. And he says, since it's a Pesik Reisha, that resolves the issue of Melacha She'ein Tzrich Legufa, Da b'shuri v'shuri ba'im ke'echad, because the cooking and the hardening, the softening and the hardening come together, ba'im ke'echad, they come at the same time. Now, the Ran is difficult to understand because he asks the question we wanted him to ask, that this is a melacha she'ein tzrich legufa. I don't want the result of the softening, I only want the hardening. He also says it's an unintended side consequence, which is difficult. It's not unintended at all, it's part of the process. And then he answers no, because it's inevitable, it's a Pesik Reisha. Pesik Reisha is a concept in side consequences, it's not a concept in the issue of melacha she'ein tzrich legufa, melacha when I'm doing, I don't want the outcome. If I put a cup over the bee, this is Pesik Reisha. It's inevitable that the bee will be trapped. If I take the rubbish out of my house, this is a Pesik Reisha. The rubbish will end up outside my house. Nonetheless, it's a melacha she'ein tzrich legufa. It's a melacha I'm doing where I don't want the positive effect. I just want to remove a problem for myself. So Pesik Reisha is not a halachically relevant term to use around the question of melacha she'ein tzrich legufa. And yet the Ran merges these two. But he merges it in a clearer way than Ramban, and hopefully one that gives us the answer to the question, because he says, it's impossible without it, and then he adds in this idea that the bishulei mana, that the softening and the shururei mana, the hardening, are ba'im ke'echad, they come at the same time. And I think what the Ran is saying over here is a new principle, which is the concept of arguing that something is an unintended side consequence, or the concept of arguing that I don't need it for the positive, I only need it for the negative, or indeed the concept of arguing, this I'm adding into the Ran, I have no proof for, that something is a temporary stage, only makes sense when it's not part of the tahalich, when it's not part of the process. When it's part of the process, it's a step in achieving the end result. I can't argue by saying I want to remove a problem and therefore this isn't a positive outcome. I don't want the outcome. It's true that in a sense to harden the wood, I need to remove the liquid in the wood, and that's what hardens it. However, this is the way of hardening it. This is the step-by-step process of manufacturing it. So this isn't removal of a problem. This is the positive outcome in getting there. In a sense, many melachos are removals of problems. I mean, why can't I argue that boreh is removal of a problem? Why can't I argue that threshing is a removal of a problem. The answer is it is a removal of a problem, but this is organically built into the positive outcome I need to get, which is to manufacture bread. I need to take it through this process. And therefore the Ran is arguing that since here the cooking is, I mean, maybe cooking is also always removal of a problem. I can't have raw meat, therefore I want the positive. In this case, the removal of the problem is the positive of the melacha. And therefore, the process, the talich of hardening pegs always goes through the process of softening and boiling off the liquid. And therefore, this isn't a temporary outcome. This is a permanent outcome. What's the permanent outcome of the cooking of the liquid? That the liquid, it contributes its share to now getting to the permanent outcome, which is the hardening of the wood. This isn't an anus shricha legufa where I don't need it for its primary purpose. This is the primary purpose. This is a type of cooking. There are things that I need to cook in order to make them edible, and there's things that I need to cook in order to harden the peg as the end result. So this is the manufacturing process. If you can't argue this is incidental or side or unnecessary or unwanted in any way, this is exactly what I want. I want to get to stage B in order to get to stage C. So I think this answers the questions according to in this reading of the Ran and the Ramban, and this is something we're going to revisit later. That this is what this is telling us is, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to look at this topic over here, even though the sources are built around the Gemara and Avodah Zarah, because what it's telling us is that the depth of the answer of the Gemara of why I'm chayiv for the bishul over here is because the bishul isn't an incidental step, it's the very process that I need to get in order to achieve the positive outcome that I wish to get to.
Could I ask a question, please, on going back to the Tosfot and Ritva on the Melachet Machshevet point and subsidiary intention?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm just a bit confused because previously in Shabbat we've seen, and there's an example that comes to mind, with Torah, right, where we talked about that either you're engaged in an eating activity or you're engaged in a sorting activity, and we kind of distinguish between the two kinds of engagement, the two kinds of things. We tend to say that you're either doing one or the other, but here we're suddenly saying that actually secondary intention matters, right? It's you're doing both a bishul and you're doing a hardening. Could you clarify that?
Yes. I think the answer to the question, I'm delighted you asked this question now rather than 10 minutes ago, because we've laid the groundwork, I think, to answer this question also, which is there are engagements and hisaskios where they contradict. There are engagements where they're subsumed, and there are engagements where this is the very chashivas of the outcome. So the svara in Boireh is that achila is achila, it's eating, it's not manufacturing. And therefore it contradicts what I'm engaged in is not the creative act of producing a result in the world. I'm engaged in the subjective experience of eating. As opposed to over here, where it's all about objective manufacture of an object. I'm trying to produce a usable object. The production of this usable object involves stages, and therefore there's no reason why each stage can't be a melacha. Indeed, all manufacture of bread involves stages, and there's no reason that each stage can't be its own melacha. And since we find there's a melacha called bishul, bishul is sometimes a melacha in the production of the av of bishul, let's say, is a melacha in the production of food. And here we have a told of bishul, which is a stage, a chosher stage in the production of pegs for tent pegs, whatever you produce pegs for.
Given that bishul applies to smamanim, which are not food, clearly there's some logic in saying that bishul in Hilchos Shabbos would apply to non-food items as well as food items.
I missed the first part of what you said, Andrew, sorry.
Because bishul applies to dyes and is only secondarily siduidapat, there's no logic in restricting bishul to food in Hilchos Shabbos, whereas there's every logic for restricting bishul to food in Avodah Zarah.
Okay, that is a superb point. So there is a third answer to this question, and this answer is given by Rashi on the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, and Rashi, I think, makes your point. Rashi says over here, I printed this on page 1 in the source. In fact, while we're looking at Rashi, I'll just point out that I should have mentioned this. The Kova bar Yisrael Kara Mi Kara. Rashi, when he comments on why the Yisrael buried the gourd, he says, "V'hit min Yisrael b'tanul the last chayot." The Yisrael hid a raw pumpkin or whatever it is, gourd, in the oven. Kodem shosak katana, before it was lit. The overcoming misikav in the special dalas, and over the pagan lit it and cooked the dalas. So Rashi points out over here that the Jew had nothing to do with the process of the cooking. That's why it's bishul akum. But Rashi anyway carries on, and I printed this on page 1 in the handout sheet. He says, "Ma'u detema, why would I have thought there'd be an issue of bishul akum? Hai over the chavim the bushule lahai sichsar chavim." He had intention to cook this peg. V'halashem bishul hisika, and therefore he lit the oven with intention to cook. Kamash malon. So what's the kamash malon? Says Rashi, the ein bishul b'kedem. There is no bishul with kedem. The concept of bishul doesn't apply with utensils. The concept of bishul only applies with food. So Rashi says as follows: what's the kamash malon of the Gemara? That bishul doesn't apply to utensils. Bishul only applies to food. Now there's two questions in Rashi. One is textual. How does he read the language of the Gemara? Because the Gemara doesn't answer that. The Gemara doesn't say that there's no bishul with food. The Gemara says that it's nishure monochamachavin. He's intending to harden the peg. So Rashi learns that we've sung the Gemara to the wrong tune. Because we came from the Gemara in Shabbos, we thought that the reading in the Gemara was nishure monochamachavin. His intention is to harden, not to soften. Rashi says the tune of the Gemara should be l'shure monochamachavin. His intention is to harden a utensil, and that's not bishul, because bishul is with food, not with utensils. Now, how can Rashi say that bishul is with food, not with utensils? Our Gemara is explicit that bishul even applies with non-food items, with utensils. And the answer is, I think Edward's reasoning, that with respect to Shabbos, there's no reason to assume that the outcome of food production is more chashuv than the outcome of keli production. Indeed, in the Mishkan, the example of bishul was with non-food production. However, when it comes to bishul akum, where the whole gezerah is mishum chasnus, because of cooking, of marriage, and we want therefore to cooking, so there's a logic to say this is a takonos of chazal, a gezerah of chazal, in the context of food, and therefore, and we're aware of that, by the way. No one ever suggested that the peg should be also because of bishul akum. The gourd is also because of bishul akum. Our question is the pagan cooking considered like the pagan lighting the field, where the cooking, he had no intention to cook at all, he had the intention to burn a field, and the chagavim happened to become charred, the locusts happened to become charred? Or is it that no, he's intending to cook, just intending to cook a peg, not a food? Says Rashi, the bishul that's relevant to halachas of bishul akum refers to food cooking as opposed to utensil cooking. Now, the reason why other Rishonim don't say like Rashi is they are aware that the gezerah of bishul akum is a food gezerah, but they say nonetheless, what was the pagan's intention? To cook. He did intend to cook. He intended to cook a peg, not food, but they did an act of cooking. Rashi considers these two sorts of cooking a different class of cooking, and therefore Rashi says utensil cooking isn't the intention that's relevant when it comes to food cooking, which is what bishul akum is about. So this is a third answer to the Gemara. We run out of time, so we will stop there. Tuesday will be the final shiur. We have missed out one answer to Gemara of the Tosafot, and then there's a very, very fascinating topic in the next source, the Nishmas Adam from the author of the Chai Adam and the Chasam Sofer and the Tosas Rosh. Very, very interesting topic, one that I was completely unaware of till learning the sugya this time round, and that will be the concluding shiur on this sugya and the concluding shiur before the summer break. Wish everyone a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day, everyone.